You might have heard the legend that in 1905, 5 captured Cossacks were brought before the Emperor of Japan. He decided to test their skills and pitted them against 5 of his finest samurai from his personal guard. Each Cossack made just one move, and the fight was over, not in favor of the Japanese, of course. Or maybe you've come across the story of a Serbian soldier, Alexander Saičić, who served in the Russian Imperial Army. Before a battle, he supposedly faced off against a samurai in a duel and won. As a reward, Nicholas II granted him a lifelong pension, and the soldiers nicknamed him Muramets, after the legendary Russian warrior. Sounds epic, right? But these tales aren't just questionable to historians. They're hilarious to anyone remotely familiar with Japan's history. Today, we're taking a quick gallop through that history to figure out who really ended the samurai, and why these stories are just myths. The thing is, islands, especially small and isolated ones, aren't usually ideal for the rise of civilizations and states, but Japan turned out to be an exception. First off, it's pretty big. Modern Japan is actually larger than Germany or Poland. The main island, Honshu, stretches about 1,300 kilometers. That's roughly the distance from Moscow to the Caucasus Mountains, or, heading east instead of south, nearly to Yekaterinburg. Secondly, not far away in China, one of the world's oldest civilizations was flourishing. This proximity meant that at least part of Japan's population didn't get stuck in the Stone Age. In fact, Japan emerged from it when Alexander the Great had already passed away, Roman law was taking shape, and Eratosthenes had calculated the Earth's circumference with impressive accuracy. Japan's statehood began forming during what we'd call the early Middle Ages. The first Japanese state, Yamato, borrowed everything it could from its neighbors in Korea and China. In ancient times, Japan was also known as Nihon or Nippon, which translates to the land of the rising sun. Of course, it was the land of the rising sun from China's perspective, not Japan's, since for the Japanese the sun rose from across the ocean. But because of Japan's unique conditions, many Chinese administrative systems like civil service exams and ranking structures either didn't work or worked very differently. So despite borrowing heavily, Japan didn't become a copy of China. It carved its own path. As in many parts of the world, rulers in the East liked to flaunt their status by the number of women they had. Japanese emperors were no exception, often having over 100 concubines and, naturally, a lot of children. These kids needed to be taken care of, and they weren't exactly being set up as farmers. Instead, they were granted land under special conditions. But jumping ahead a bit, throughout Japan's medieval period, one major problem loomed over the island states: Ainu tribes. These were fierce warriors who lived by hunting and some livestock farming. Despite lacking a state or agriculture, they were incredibly skilled in warfare. The Japanese referred to these proto-Ainu tribes as emishi, which, according to one theory, meant brave warriors. The Ainu were such a persistent problem that Japan didn't establish full control over Hokkaido until the mid-15th century, and they weren't fully subdued until the 18th century. Even then, some say the key factor in their defeat wasn't tactics, it was cannons. For most of Japan's medieval history, its geopolitics boiled down to fighting either local or foreign barbarians, like the Mongols who occasionally sailed over from the mainland, or engaging in endless internal conflicts. And of course, wars require warriors. That's why the emperor's land-owning children started forming what we'd now call private military companies, essentially their own personal armies. Naturally, the best way to secure a warrior's loyalty was either with a hefty paycheck or by granting him land and peasants. By the 12th century, this system gave rise to the samurai class, right around the same time European knighthood fully took shape. Unlike knights, though, samurai were primarily mounted archers. It's said they adopted this fighting style from the Ainu, while their weapons and armor were influenced by Chinese designs. Over time, this military feudal class took control of the government. From 1192 onward, the real power in Japan rested with the shoguns, military leaders who ran the country. But humans have always liked to believe that their country is led by some wise and noble ruler, maybe even one with divine origins. This idea has been ingrained in the human psyche since ancient times. The presence of such a figure makes people more accepting of their hardships. After all, if your local ruler was corrupt, that was just bad luck. But at the very top, surely, there was a just and righteous sovereign. That's why, for most of Japanese history, the emperor remained a revered but mostly symbolic figure. In the mid-16th century, the Portuguese arrived in Japan. They started trading firearms, armor, and other goods for Japanese gold and silver. Trading posts popped up, and along with them, Christianity began spreading rapidly. But when Christian peasants in Shimabara launched an uprising and even managed to defeat samurai forces early on, Japan decided it had seen enough. By 1641, the country went into full isolation mode. Fun fact: to crush a peasant rebellion of about 30,000 people, the shogunate deployed a samurai army nearly 200,000 strong. And despite this massive advantage, around 10,000 shogunate warriors were killed. After that, Japan remained a fully medieval state for the next century, until someone came knocking in 1853. That someone was an American fleet led by Commodore Perry, demanding Japan open up for trade. The thing was, those American ships had long-range cannons that could easily flatten Japan's coastal defenses, and, well, Japan didn't really have anything to counter them. The Japanese briefly considered standing their ground, but they were quickly reminded who held the bigger guns and were forced to sign a trade agreement. This was a huge blow to the reputation of the shogun and the samurai class. Meanwhile, that same year, the Crimean War kicked off, eventually leading to a defeat for the Russian Empire. That loss was a wake-up call, highlighting Russia's technological backwardness. Some leaders realized that without reforms and the abolition of serfdom, the gap between Russia and the West would only widen. But while Russia had at least been trying to modernize its army since the days of Peter the Great, Japan was still clinging to a medieval system where its military consisted almost entirely of samurai, who, not having watched any epic movies about themselves, weren't exactly eager to test their skills against the Americans. Ironically, Japan's backwardness ended up working in its favor. The Choshu domain decided to study the enemy up close and sent a group of young noblemen to London. Among them was a certain Ito Hirobumi, who would later become Japan's prime minister. Seeing London in contrast to their own medieval world, Ito and his peers realized Japan had no chance against the West as things stood. The ruling elite came to an inevitable conclusion. The entire system needed to be torn down and rebuilt from scratch. The period between 1868 and 1889 is known as the Meiji Restoration, named after Emperor Meiji. During this time, the shogun lost his power. Japan sent delegations all over the world to gather intel on government structures, military organizations, and reform strategies. Based on what they learned, radical political changes kicked off in 1868. The government was split into branches, officials became elected, and ministries were established. Over the following years, the state structure took on a distinctly Western character, while the emperor's role shifted to more of an overseer of government functions. Of course, none of this happened peacefully. There was an all-out war between the pro-shogun forces and the emperor's supporters, with the latter emerging victorious. In 1869, the medieval lord-vassal system was officially abolished. The government declared all social classes, peasants, artisans, and merchants, equal, regardless of their professions or status. In 1871, restrictions on travel and job changes were lifted. Land was transferred from feudal lords to the emperor, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes not so much. By 1872, conscription was introduced, laying the foundation for a modern Western-style military. But not everyone was thrilled about these changes, especially the former samurai landowners, who weren't exactly ready to embrace their new reality. One of the most hated reforms came in 1871. A ban on samurai carrying swords and wearing traditional top knots. Many simply ignored it until 1876, when the government cracked down hard, leading to the short-lived Shinpuran Rebellion, also known as the Kamikaze Uprising. It was swiftly crushed, and 86 rebels ended up taking their own lives in ritual suicide. But that was just the beginning. In 1877, the much larger Satsuma Rebellion erupted. Around 20,000 samurai set out to seize Kumamoto Castle, assuming it would be an easy victory. The garrison was made up of just over 4,000 recently recruited commoners. But the samurai were in for a nasty surprise. The siege dragged on. Eventually, 9,000 imperial troops arrived and fought an 8-day battle against 15,000 samurai. Meanwhile, government forces seized the capital of the rebel province, forcing the samurai into retreat. In the end, the rebellion was crushed, marking the final defeat of the old order. On September 24, 1877, the samurai era officially came to an end. The last remnants of the rebel army, just like in that famous movie, charged at imperial riflemen with nothing but swords. Not out of loyalty to tradition, but simply because they had run out of ammo. The aftermath of the Satsuma Rebellion was brutal for the samurai. They were simply wiped out. Thousands of rebels were executed, and the entire class lost all privileges. Not only were they banned from carrying weapons, but even their traditional hairstyles were outlawed. In other words, measures introduced before the uprising were now strictly enforced. A significant number of former samurai were sent to Hokkaido to settle and cultivate new land. The new imperial army was built primarily from former peasants, who were far more loyal to the emperor than the ex-landowners who had just lost everything. In just 2 decades, Japan had catapulted itself from the medieval era straight into modernity. The Meiji Revolution dismantled the rigid class system, allowing this island nation to rapidly become one of the strongest powers in Asia. But it's important to note that while peasants gained more personal freedoms, their quality of life didn't improve much, because that wasn't really the goal. The early economic benefits of these reforms were funneled into military expansion and territorial conquests. As a result, Japan quickly transformed into a full-fledged empire, one whose aggressive policies wouldn't truly change until the events of 1945. Yet as a social class, the samurai would remain forever trapped in that old medieval Japan, the very one that the Japanese themselves had to dismantle.